Hi, everyone, and thanks again for joining me for another one of my interviews here on GaudiumEtSpes22.com and my YouTube channel. And just FYI, to everyone that's been asking, I will post this as both a YouTube video and an audio file if people just want the audio file. And I'm going to be starting actually a podcast. That'll be up on Spotify and Apple and all those sorts of things. So this
Excellent.
interview also might eventually be up on those platforms. Everyone's been begging me, oh, your interviews are so good, and but we want to listen to it on Apple or Google or whatever. Okay,
Yeah.
so fine, it's on its
Excellent.
way. I'm
Good.
going to be using Podbean or something like that. I don't know.
I was re-listening to your interview with Cyril O'Regan yesterday, but I had to have it on YouTube while I was driving. So like I just let it play through my because I was like,
Yeah, and that's the problem. That's what.
yeah.
Oh, and okay, so in case people don't know, I'm interviewing once again, I think for the third time, maybe even more. I don't know.
I
Father
think
Harrison Ayre.
third time on here at least. You've been on my show a couple times
I've been
too.
on your
So
show,
and
Father
we'll get you back
Harrison
on there
Ayre.
too. Yeah.
And for those who are listening, it's spelled Ayre, Father Harrison Ayre, who's a priest in Western Canada. And he also runs the Clerically Speaking podcast that he does with Father Anthony. And I've been on that podcast once, I do believe.
Twice, actually, I think.
Maybe twice. Okay.
Yeah.
Twice.
Yeah.
I lose track.
I know. I lose track of things too sometimes.
It's a very, very popular podcast and called Clerically Speaking. And I encourage all of my viewers and listeners to go check it out because it's not only informative and fun, it's funny and it's great. So please go do that. But today, what a lot of people may not know is that Father Harrison is also doing a doctoral dissertation for his doctorate on the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI. And I'm on a bit of a move these days to air a lot of interviews with Ratzinger experts. Last week I did one with Dr. Roland Millare and his excellent book on Ratzinger. And in a week or so, I'm going to be interviewing Father Vincent Twomey, who knew Ratzinger and knows a lot about Ratzinger's politics and so forth as well. So that'll be coming up. So stay tuned. But today
I'll have to get you in touch with Dr. Andrew Kaethler too in Vancouver, who did his thesis on Ratzinger and Schmemann.
Ooh, that could be very interesting.
I'll have to get you in touch.
So we're going to have a whole Ratzinger theme here over the next couple of months. So that's great because I think he's a thinker who needs to be unpacked even more. Than what he is. Now, Father Harrison sent me a long email a couple of weeks ago. It was kind of in response, maybe it was to my interview with Dr. Millare, I don't know, where Dr. Millare and I were wondering how to characterize Ratzinger's approach to politics, theologically speaking, and whether or not he fit into the category that has come to be known as sort of Catholic post-liberalism, post-liberal. Characters like Michael Hanby, a Patrick Deneen, and a few others who are very, very critical of the political movement known as liberalism and have developed post-liberal concepts, and that seems to be all the rage these days. And full disclosure, I would characterize myself in that school of thought, definitely in the school of thought represented by Michael Hanby in particular, as post-liberal. But it did seem to me, and I raised this in the interview, that it is somewhat difficult to pigeonhole Joseph Ratzinger, even though he's critical at points of liberalism. It's not exactly accurate to describe him as a post-liberal. And you wrote a long email in response to me, and so perhaps let's just begin by you stating why you think it is true that it's a bit not necessarily wrong, but it's simplistic to simply lump Ratzinger in with the post-liberal movement.
It's just simplistic to lump Ratzinger, period. He can't do it. It's impossible.
He's not lumpable in just about any other way. He resists lumpation.
Exactly. I like that. I mean, it's one of the frustrating things sometimes of trying to even write on him because he writes on so many different things. And so, but he because I've been reflecting on this lately, how because of his ecclesial career, his ability to develop more systematic works got kind of interrupted, essentially. Like eschatology is kind of his last big work. And then, I mean, Jesus of Nazareth is kind of his pet project he wanted to do over the years, but the rest of these things that he wanted to work on just never really got a chance to happen. So, yeah, with and I would say that his discussion around the relationship between liberalism and democracy kind of comes out in, I would call it like, I've been kind of periodizing Ratzinger into kind of three distinct periods right now. It's more of a thematic periodization than anything else, where, and in that sense, like he puts more emphasis. Again, he never neglects the rest of the questions, but in the night from his early theological career of seminary formation up until about 1968, he's dealing with the question of existentialism is actually the big one for him right there. And then 1968 is a turning point, not to becoming a conservative, but the question changes. He sees existentialism as defeated. Essentially, it couldn't grab hold, and the revolts, the student revolts of 1968, is proof that it couldn't grab hold, and that Marxism became the dominant idea that he then starts to deal with in this period.
Yeah,
and then
stop there 1 second. You mentioned the student revolt in 1968. Some of the viewers, listeners may not know exactly to what that is in reference. So very briefly, and I don't mean to interrupt you and lose your train of thought, but very briefly describe what that student revolt involved.
It was just, I mean, well, it's interesting because he actually doesn't, he speaks about it as an event, but he doesn't really go much into the details. He talks about how students were, he's dealing more with the spiritual question, like what they were unhappy with. They found the post-war construction of Europe and Germany as dissatisfactory. Like it wasn't doing what they were trying to do. And it's in the materialistic, the material goods of the time were actually quite good. I think the employment rate in Germany is like 0.9% unemployment rate at the time. There are jobs everywhere. Everyone's working, like things are looking, it seems like for the first time things are looking good. But the revolt, I mean, France, it got into quite a lot of violence, obviously. In Germany, there was just a lot of student revolts, protests, yelling in classrooms, like a real violent, like there was like, I would call it like an intellectual violence, if you to try and bring a kind of Marxist vision to things at this time. It kind of fails. It's like, I'd call it like a half failure. It doesn't grab hold politically, obviously, but it does grab hold culturally and spiritually.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And he kind of talks about this actually in his letter as Pope Emeritus on the sex abuse crisis. Right. He talks about how there was a real revolution of thought around sex and so on and so forth around this period too. And it really brought a real change. Like it was a really quickened cultural change and shift that was totally foreign to what they knew before. Yeah.
Okay. Go back to then your train of thought, and existentialism had failed and so on.
Great.
Go on.
So then 1989 happens, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, and Russian communism fails, and the communist state falls apart. And so it's in this period, as head of the Congregation for Doctrine of Faith, that he begins to deal with the question of democracy more particularly. And it's really in this period that the question about what is Europe really emerges in his thought. And so his political thought, qua political thought, I think comes to its greatest maturation and its greatest intensity in the post-1989 period. I think part of this is due to his position. He thinks Europe has something distinctive to offer. And his critiques go often, like, so because he's such a subtle thinker, and he's never going to just pit it all on one thing. But I would argue, I'm arguing essentially that his critiques of liberalism, or what he'd call it more like liberal capitalism, is falling under the same pressures as Marxism, which is a materialistic interpretation of history and man. Why? Because he's criticizing, more particularly, at least in terms of Europe, and Europe unification. And he's not against European unification, by the way. He was actually very pro it in its initial forms because of its Christian roots. It was actually trying to bring about a Christian-informed democracy again. But there's a large fear in Europe around religion in general because of, like, they're still fearful of the 17th century, essentially, and the wars of religion. It's like an existential threat that hangs over their head to this day. But he's really fighting against what he calls like a materialistic vision of man and culture and society. So Europe he sees the European model of shaping history around economics. And that's his big that's his attacking point constantly. Right. It's actually in this period that he speaks somewhat positively of the American experiment, actually. Interestingly, not tout court, but more in its in its origins. He loves to quote de Tocqueville in this time about why is the American experiment seeming to work? Well, they have a unified Christian vision of morality, which is the underpinning, the cultural underpinning that allows democracy to thrive. And so for de Tocqueville and for Ratzinger, he says this is the argument that for a state to be properly a state, and this gets into like your Dignitatis Humanae discussions, it needs to be undergirded by something transcendent to itself, namely God, universal moral commandments. He actually thinks that this is an area where the Enlightenment can actually have some positive influence here to determine how do you do this in a pluralistic society, for example. But he's really going after materialism as like as an underpinning thing. And this is the interesting thing, because I know you're a fan of Augusto Del Noce, and
I was just going to bring him up.
Yeah,
very good. Go for it.
Because Del Noce, from what I've read of him at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Del Noce seems to see, like, with the fall of communism in Russia, its materialistic trends then kind of flow into Europe at this time. Ratzinger sees materialism way earlier, way earlier. He actually sees it as essentially since the Enlightenment, essentially, it's been the normative way of seeing nature, world, man, history, etc. And so he actually does not see it as necessarily something much later. He actually sees it as something much earlier. And so the forces of history itself have been strongly moved by materialistic ideologies in one form or another. So he's going after, so his thing with liberalism itself is he's saying, not that he actually thinks democracy can be a good thing. He actually does think that.
Wow.
I know. But it needs to be rooted in a perspective and relationship with God. It needs to be rooted in some form of a natural law. And it needs to be not materialistic. And this is where I think his apologetic, if you will, I think is its strongest, because, and he does this, his forward to Introduction to Christianity in the 2000 edition it's a masterpiece. Like, it's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And this is where he goes into these ideas a lot. He sees the failure of Marxism as a failure to account for man's spirit.
Right.
And that its fall is actually kind of proof of the fact of its almost bloodless fall. It wasn't through war or anything else. It was through man's encounter under persecution with his own freedom and his ability to withstand in suffering for a greater good. He's going after Europe, for example, then with its notions of liberalism and its liberal capitalism as as falling for the same error of materialism that Russian Marxism did. And he's saying, yeah, so he sees, and it really, actually, what he's trying to say to Europe is say, European Union, fine. He actually has no problem with it. He thinks it's a good thing for a variety of reasons, but it needs to be authentically European. And Europe is not Europe without Christianity. Like, Europe as an idea is impossible without Christianity. And if you want to be unique in the world, if you really want to shape the world and history, you have to stand above this materialistic form, because it creates competition. And there are greater economic forces than Europe out there that can gain kind of greater hold of things. It can suffocate Europe. What makes Europe distinctive as a shaper of the world is its Christianity. And that is why he keeps on, like, harping at them, saying, don't fall for the same error as Marxism. Look to man's spirit. Man is a spiritual and free creature, and make that like the anthropological basis of society.
Okay, so in a lot of ways, there's a resonance here with John Paul II as well, because I remember when communism fell, and of course everyone, the Pope was happy that Poland was now free to be its own nation, but almost immediately John Paul starts hammering away at the idea that now that we have broken free of the Marxist stranglehold, the Soviet stranglehold in Poland, we must avoid now falling into the opposite extreme of Western consumeristic capitalism, which also then has that common materialistic foundation. And you saw John Paul railing against that. And please, my fellow Poles, do not succumb to this materialistic temptation. And sadly, it seems as if Poland is succumbing to that materialistic temptation.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. And I wouldn't be, I mean, obviously these two work so closely together.
Yeah.
one can't help but see their crossover with another. I mean, I would love to find out through archives one day how much Ratzinger wrote of Veritatis Splendor.
Oh yeah, that would be a
Because like
very interesting deep dumpster dive into textual criticism.
because for Ratzinger, one of his key criterias of history and everything is martyrdom. Like it's like for him, like the existential stance of the Christian. And there's a whole section on Christian martyrdom in Veritatis Splendor.
There is.
Yeah.
And there's also, I mean, and I don't want to get too far
Yeah.
from coming back to your train of thought. There are also deep resonances there with Hans Urs von Balthasar's polemical little book, quoted Ode to Ensfall in English, The Moment of Christian Witness. But Balthasar repeats it elsewhere as well, that the nature of Christian existence is cruciform, and therefore the ultimate mark of the Christian in Christian life is some form of martyrdom. And so this seems to be a current that runs through Balthasar, Ratzinger, Wojtyła, across the board, which I think is interesting. Now, I want to go back to your email though, and not stray too far from this notion that what Ratzinger was most concerned with in modern politics was its materialism. So you said something very interesting in the email where you said that it's probably better to characterize Joseph Ratzinger not as post-liberal but as post-materialist, which I think is probably kind of true.
Yeah.
And I also think that it's true based on my limited reading of Ratzinger, that he goes further than Del Noce in seeing the roots of this materialism all the way back already in the Enlightenment. And I suppose others would roll it back even further into the rise of nominalism.
Right. He can set that here and there sometimes too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I always hesitate to drag nominalism into the thing because
it's so easy.
Everybody and their blind pet hamster wants to blame nominalism for everything. It's like, I can show you in 5 easy historical steps the path from nominalism to the Holocaust, the Shoah. And it's like, oh well, okay, nominalism was bad, but but actually, and at some point, I mean, this is one of the problems of intellectual genealogies. But anyway, you were going to say something.
Well, I was going to say, I would call, like, for example, here, like, I would actually call Ratzinger like maybe like a limited genealogist.
Yes,
because genealogy, in some way, shape, or form, at least as it's often portrayed, sticks to almost, it kind of falls victim to this kind of materialistic notion of science and knowledge and so on and so forth. He is not denying material conditions. Like that's the other thing. He's also not being like Hegelian here either, by the way. Like he is not denying our embodiedness or any way, shape, or form. He's German. He tends to love to speak in these grand summative words that can seem abstract and therefore disembodied, but he is by no way, shape, or form antibody or anti-material, or even noticing how the material that there are, like he's always saying, like, Marx is right about material conditions. He's just wrong that he thinks that we don't have a freedom to rise above it. Right. So he has no problem with this. And I think that's his great genius in some ways. He's always willing to put, like, to great pains and probably to some annoyance to a lot of people, he will always find some form of good in whoever he's engaging with. Always.
Yeah, I think that's true.
It's a mark of his intellectual charity. And you see that actually in practice when he was head of the CDF. You hear him pulling people in the office, and he's bending over backwards to keep them in communion with the church, and reads them with such a generosity. They say, you went to the office, you felt like he read you, he understood you. Which is
just Father Harrison, I think you need to stay closer to your microphone.
Yeah. Sorry.
As soon as you back away, your voice gets a little tinny and
gotcha.
And
distant. Sorry,
so I agree with that. And that's the thing here. It's important for Catholic intellectuals, I think, to engage in these kinds of intellectual genealogies, because the genealogical tradition, I mean, especially as it flows through Nietzsche and then on into the modern world, is very destructive in its own way. And so we have to tease out of the intellectual genealogy a sort of a different pathway than what it actually takes in the dialectic of a kind of materialist understanding of things. But
I was
go
going
ahead.
to say, yeah, I was going to say two things with this. So that the is that I would call him like limited genealogists. I mean this by like, and I think this fits into his like larger vision of history as it works and unfolds. He recognizes that, but for him, it's actually like it's not a he is not a material genealogist in any way, shape, or form. I call it like there is a logic to history, but it's the logic of freedom and person. And
Yeah,
so for him,
yeah,
these
yeah,
events matter because they mediate something real that we're still acting out of today. Um, when I say that word reason today, it is heard very differently than a medieval would hear it. Why? Because of real historical events and how I receive as a human being forms me in a new way. And we need to be
yeah,
aware of that. And that's vital and important. And that there are still like, so when he's talking about the past, he's not talking about it as a relic to show, well, we actually have to kind of, for him, genealogy in its best sense is always something mediatory about today. He's always like the past is actually being mediated today through like
yeah,
like, so for him the French Revolution is a big event. It's a foundational event. For him it is the event the church has been trying to wrestle with for the last 2 centuries. If there's anything he is post of besides like materialism as like an intellectual idea in terms of politics, he is definitely post French Revolution 100%. He says that this is why Vatican II was called, actually, was to deal with
yeah.
the French Revolution. uh but
So
yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
um yeah, so but just like with this notion of history, then that it's not just like a scientific investigation of the past, but that because it for him history mediates being, like this is his big thing really.
Yeah,
uh
yeah,
and that you have to have them so well together. This investigation of the past is always at work in the present. And so when he's like talking about 1989, he's talking about it in such a way because it's really still experienced today. And so he's actually always trying to engage man today. And so if he's ever doing a genealogy, it's always in reference to the today, whereby we now have the opportunity to make a free choice for God anew. And he's trying to reveal, like, so we can maybe go into this later. It's something I'm still developing a bit, but it's what I call like his apocalyptic apologetics. He's always
we
trying to
will come back to
reveal,
that.
yeah, well,
Yeah,
because he's always trying to reveal the inner structure of man and history, and to show that actually man is always searching for God, even when he isn't.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's very true. And I definitely want to come back to that because that
Yeah.
fascinates me, a notion of a sort of this dragging the category of apocalyptic into this. But I'm going to go back to the French Revolution,
Yeah.
and I think because I think he's entirely accurate, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to use the cliche to figure out that the church did indeed react strongly to the French Revolution,
Hmm.
and laicite, and and the secularization, the rapid secularization of French society, and the sort of the de-establishment of the church and the pushing of the church to the margins,
Hmm.
which then set the tone for the rest of Europe, and what went on there. And the reaction, I mean, you cannot understand modern Catholicism. Uh, and this is hard for Americans sometimes to get their minds around because we don't have that European focus. But well up until modern times, the church was Eurocentric in its intellectuals, in its vision, in its attitude towards politics. And the fact of the matter is, the French Revolution, as far as many in the church were concerned, ruined everything.
Right.
And that then caused the church to retrench, circle the wagons, put it in this defensive posture vis-a-vis civil society with both fists. So it gave Catholicism its classic formulation is fortress Catholicism, both fists up pugilistically. We were being assaulted by Protestants. We were being assaulted by science and Enlightenment reason and secularism. We were being assaulted then now in the political domain. So now we need to, in a sense, firmly ensconce papal infallibility, as this dogma that is a bulwark. Not that I oppose papal infallibility,
Hmm.
but its
Hmm.
uses
Gives us
as
the historical context. Yeah.
this bulwark against the
Yeah.
modern world set the tone for the view of many then in Europe was the Catholic Church is simply opposed to modernity.
Right.
And so that leads Ratzinger to the conclusion that this is exactly why the Second Vatican Council was needed. Now, you said in your email that then Ratzinger goes on to say the problem with the council isn't that it's been embraced too much, but that it's been embraced too little, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's been way. I mean, and I think people who read your blog or listen to your videos, I think know this. They know this very well. It's
Yeah.
because, like, I mean, at least the communio interpretation, which I really do think is the valid interpretation of dignitatis humanae, and DC
Yeah.
Schindler's, I think, brought this out quite well around that. Like, its argument is still saying no, after life, obviously, because you can't have any other rights without life. Man's first right is religious, and not as
Yeah.
like this. But the problem is, we actually in North America still read it through a Murrayist lens of a blank slate of freedom.
Yeah.
But freedom in a Christian context is actually, uh, it's in relationship with other persons and with God. So it's like got its horizontal and this vertical relationship, and it can't be freedom without choosing the good of both. And thus, to be free, to actually exercise religious freedom, is to exercise one's search for the truth, which is God, and that is the principle around which all society is to be oriented around and constructed around. Like, that is a radical argument when you think about
Yeah.
it,
The
but it's
truth
saying
of
that this
God.
can happen in a non-integralist fashion. And I think actually, I think Schindler has been just so good about this because he's kind of listened to the integralist critiques and says, actually, there is some truth here again. Like, there is something here, and we need to listen to that. But at the same time, that its problem is that it's actually not Christian enough. It's not, because it actually can allow for, it has to allow for a freedom to exercise itself historically, which means, like, yeah, it can be a society, if you want. Maybe this is a little too pie in the sky right now in our current climate of the world, but imagine a society that organized itself around the notion of religious freedom, and it saw that the Catholic vision of this was its best instantiation. A Hindu could actually probably be most a Hindu in a Catholic world, because it would
Yeah.
recognize the truth that's there, and it would say, just continue to be oriented to. It's not saying, like, it's not being value neutral. It's saying, no, we have the truth, we do, but the truth is lived out. There is a historicity to the truth, and it's being lived out and searched for. And so you have to leave a space for man to discover this truth. And if we're all oriented towards this truth, it can actually allow for a vibrant pluralism without imposition, but also without being value neutral. And I think for Ratzinger, that is actually, I think, a very vibrant vision. I think his arguments around the European Union is actually a big part of this. I would then also say, then, for him, really, and it's not something I've been going into too much. I've just kind of dabbled in this a bit because my German is still pretty shoddy, so I depend on a lot of translation software to help me with it. But I've been dabbling in his doctoral thesis on Augustine, which I'm
Oh yeah,
surprised
come
is
to
not
this, because you
translated.
mentioned it. Yeah, you mentioned in your email the
So
Augustinian roots of a
yeah,
lot of this.
and I think a good English correlate to this is John Cavadini. I think he presents a Ratzingerian interpretation of the City of God. So for Ratzinger, there is a mutual for his reading of Augustine. There is a mutual interdependence between church and world. You can't
Yes.
have one without the other. The world, if you will, is kind of like the matter to the form of the church. You can't, the church, like, even when I'm saying mass at my church here in Nanaimo, I'm in Nanaimo. I require secular builders to put up this, like, the church absorbs, takes in, and without destroying, transforms and lifts it up to God, to the glory of God. That this is the
Yes.
Catholic way, but it's always intermingled. There's not this harsh dialectic, this harsh separation. That they actually are mutually indwelling, and that I think he does a very convincing job, as does Cavadini and others. That this is actually Augustine's vision. He's not trying to set up two opposing forces, and it's actually quite realistic, because he says, like, the church then is actually kind of fallen and is always going to be fallen because it's in a fallen world, but it has to be in the fallen world in order to enter into that world and lift it up. This is like the heart of Vatican II's notion of universal call to holiness, of its
Yeah.
vocation and dignity of the laity, of its missionary output. It recognizes a world church dynamic, and I'm kind of bracketing Gaudium et Spes a bit here because it is a little different, but there is this, like, dynamic world church dynamic in which the church, to be herself, really must be out in the world without necessarily being integrating into it in a forced way, but proposing, as John Paul always liked to say, and inviting the world into the church, and thus lifting her up into her true end and goal, which is God.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's an analogical sort of relationship there, and
Yeah.
it's not an equivocal relationship, it's analogical. And David
Right.
C. Schindler, in his book The Politics of the Real, brings this out very, very clearly, where I don't know what Ratzinger would think of this. I'm assuming he would agree, where Schindler points out, that there are those who would say, well, the reason why we need religious freedom is because the state has no competence in matters of religion, and it should
Right.
therefore just stay out of matters of religion. That's a kind of Murray-esque sort of approach to things here.
Yeah.
This separation, that's the American model, separation of church and state, because religion is not in the competency of the state. Now, that's Schindler, David C. Schindler, the younger, because the elder just passed away. I want to make that distinction clear. Points out that this is actually a kind of modernist understanding of things, because the fact of the matter is the spiritual concerns are the concern of the state, and to a certain extent the state does have to have a certain competency in spiritual matters that the church then has to, in a sense, either correct or ratify or pay attention to or whatever. But to say that the state has no competency in matters of religion is therefore to then sequester religion in an altogether different ontological plane of existence that has really no purchase on the civil and social sphere. And so, as Schindler points out, both church and state have spiritual concerns, but they're analogically related insofar as the church's focus on matters spiritual is different from the state's focus on matters spiritual,
Right.
which is why the two need to cooperate. Now, of course, all hard, and I think I'm going to get back to the Ratzinger and what his views are on liberalism, and why it might be in some ways a good thing, because all hard integralisms so far have crashed and burned on the altar of intolerance, on the altar of repression and oppression, on the altar of church and state collusion at the highest levels of power in order to give the church social privileges, material privileges, ideological privileges, and all those things. And this is one of the reasons why integralism, the hard integralism, has such a bad name, and has led to the notion that they should just be completely separated from each other. So liberalism comes in and says, "Niet, we're not going to have these church and state relationships. Religion is thus going to be privatized in this zone of subjectivity." So obviously that's a thumbnail caricature of liberalism, but I think there's a great deal of truth in it. What then does Ratzinger see as the strengths and the weaknesses of liberalism, as it has just concretely historically manifested itself, not necessarily in theory, but just as hard integralisms have crashed and burned, has not liberalism crashed and burned based on certain defects and faults? So what is Ratzinger's concrete analysis of liberalism?
So two things there. First, this is more general, and it's not necessarily Ratzinger, is that Murray-esque, or just that the liberal notion of religious freedom, as kind of Murray likes to tout, is itself a victim of a nature-grace separation.
Yes,
it was not possible, and it's not even a possible proposal without Christianity itself, because of the Christian notion of the world. And the world as having its own dominant sphere is only possible because of Christianity itself. Like we do not realize how indebted the West is to Christianity still, and the reason it's going off kilter is because it refuses to. It's been twisted off and taken apart from its roots. And I think this is something generally Ratzinger would argue. When it comes to liberalism, and actually one thing your question already proposes in my head that I definitely need to look into more is, how does he distinguish between liberalism and democracy?
Good point.
Because I think he would make a distinction. And maybe in that sense, if you were to make a separation of those two, I think he would then you could more easily label him post-liberal. But that they shouldn't, I think he might see them differently. The reason being, he speaks very positively of the German democratic experience of the 1950s, the post-war German democratic experience. He saw it as a very hopeful time. And this is the other thing, people have to realize, the hopefulness, I'm really realizing how hopeful the world was in the 50s and early 60s, because we can live together and not kill each other.
Yeah.
So it helps you understand a bit more why they're a bit more optimistic. And even he did. His pessimism does start to come out in the mid 60s. or at least his more critical turn. And if there's a turn, it's that. But his theology is always the same. But he really speaks fondly of the German experiment and how rooted, like how it was to be under God and how it's to be under Christian principles of morality. I think in that concrete experience, he would say, this is what Schindler's arguing for, essentially. The state recognizes itself that it has to be limited, because we've seen what happens when the state becomes totalitarian, when it becomes the all. It leads to absolute destruction and death. So we have to recognize there are limits to the state.
Stop right there. And that those limits are actually natural in limits, in the sense of flowing out of other organic communities within society that are not the state, that have legitimacy in their own. In other words, arguing against the notion that whatever limitations the state has are self-imposed by the state.
Right.
Which then is just a backhanded way of reasserting the total hegemony and totalitarianism of the state, however self-limiting that might be. So go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And what is really fascinating, I can't remember which book it was in. It gets confusing sometimes because God bless them, but Ignatius Press, when they've released a lot of his Europe books, and sometimes they cross-publish different articles in the same article in like 2 or 3 books. Sometimes just like where is it? Which one is it? Anyways, but he has this really interesting argument that, and Christianity has actually proven itself in one way in its moral teaching. So for all our hatred of moralism and everything, even in the church, like moralism for its own sake can be destructive when it's disrooted from Christ. He says, or derooted from Christ. He actually argues that the 10 Commandments have proven themselves essential to proper living in the world, and that this is a contribution that both Israel and Christianity actually really, the state is really required, if it wants to actually flourish, the state is required to order itself around this, because it's proven itself, regardless of the sinfulness of members. These things have not only proven to be consistent, but of real enduring value. And this is kind of recognized as true in liberal democracies today. We still, a lot of these things that we talk about, even the notion of rights, everything, we still talk about dignity, although it gets often twisted. These are only possible because of Christianity, because they've proven themselves true. But for him, he says you can't at the same time. And this is where I think he would distance himself from certain natural law theorists. When we talk about the Christian moral tradition, it has to be Christian. It has to be Christ-rooted. It has to be a recognition of who Christ is, and what he believes himself, and what we proclaim him to be. Otherwise, that moral teaching falls apart. You can't have dignity without Christ. Essentially, it's impossible.
This is one of my bugaboos, and it's been a bugaboo of mine for a long time. The limitations of natural law theory, because when you look carefully at it, natural law theory makes no sense absent some notion of God. I mean, the whole theory is grounded in it's our participation in the eternal reason of God, as we can detect it in the paradigms and structures of the created world. And so and secularists can also see those same patterns. The difference being is that if you reject God, then there's no reason why those patterns should be viewed as normative. What gives natural law theory its normative precepts is precisely the fact that there's a sort of divine element contained within those. That's why they're normative. And I think that Ratzinger therefore rightly wants to say Christ, that's why he's so Christocentric. At some point, the distinction between moralism and a real morality is got to be that the latter contains this Christic element.
And this is why he does some analysis around this, because he says it's interesting, the Enlightenment never really questioned the Christian moral tradition. Why? Why? Because it presumed still, in different forms, obviously, God as creator.
Yes.
So for him, like, he goes on a real bender in the 80s on the theology of creation. And like he really is trying to develop it. He gives a lecture. I got a sneak peek at the English translation of a book that's coming out this next year in Ignatius Press, 1985, the Gottes Project, the God Project, the Divine Project, 6 lectures.
I have that. actually,
Oh, nice,
because
nice.
I think I was asked to blurb it or something.
Oh,
But
nice.
anyway, go ahead.
I was helping the translator out with some things, and so as I was reading this, I'm like, this is it's very similar to his In the Beginning. There's a lot of similar themes there, and he's fighting materialism again, right? But he's saying that if you don't have a notion that God is creator, you really in the end actually have no morality. You only have materialism. There is
Right,
like
right,
this is
right.
this is the logic of an uncreated world, and so he really goes after evolutionism as a logic, not against evolution. He has no problem with it as a theory or as a scientific principle or anything like that. But when it becomes the determiner of life, again, so it's another form of his attacks on materialism. You just can't. If this is the case, like it becomes irrational even be talking about this stuff because what's the point? There is no meaning. There is no end. Uh, you cannot. All these things we're
Yeah,
searching
yeah,
for image.
yeah.
Like I was reading some bits of Anne Carpenter's Theopoetics on Balthasar today, and Balthasar makes a similar argument in um, Apocalypse, the Deutschen Seele,
Yeah.
Apocalypse of the German Soul,
The
right?
German
Where
soul.
where that the German move of an openness to transcendence he wants to affirm. But what he wants to not affirm, and this is in the school of Blondel, Dulabac, all these guys too, is that end can be achieved, that transcendence desire can be achieved within the immanent realm. And that's the
Yeah,
problem. And
yeah.
Ratzier's essentially making the same critique, except
Okay.
he's going after evolutionism here, right? So you remove God as creator, you have no moral foundation. You can't have a natural law theory. You can't actually even have a commonality discourse. I think this is where you're seeing the crumbling. So for him, like getting back to your earlier question about some of his where he would stand today, and it is interesting. Like it's hard to say because he's such a historical thinker in terms of like large historical events. He's kind of gone silent for so long. It's hard to think. It's hard for me to put words in his mouth. But I would think that he would say something to the effect of, "See, I told you this is the problem of materialism and democracies and in any civil society. We cannot be living this way. We actually have to rediscover man's spiritual character, and until the state does that, things are going to go more and more awry, and it's going to become more and more totalitarian. So, for example, like democracy, he does have one of his beefs with democracy is when it's. So, I think this is where he'd make a distinction between maybe liberal and democratic. A liberal notion of democracy tends to just always put the value of truth on the majority.
Yes.
For him, you can't do that. Again, that's why he saw the initial part of the American project so as such a value because it actually tried to do this. But what's happening in America now, it's moved away. So is that a problem with democracy? Is that a problem with liberalism? Or is it a bit of a problem with both? I am honestly not sure what he would say there. I think he would go more after liberalism personally, because I think he would say there's actually like he actually speaks positively, and I can't remember where I can't remember exactly what he says, but he speaks very positively of the notion of democratic socialism. Uh, Akin to Blondel does something similar, actually, right? This notion, these communal ways of approaching democracy, whereby we actually have to hold up certain norms to govern society. But for him, again, in the end, it has to be rooted in God.
Oh, absolutely. And but this all of this, I mean, John Paul talked about the eclipse of God. I think Ratzinger used similar language about the eclipse of God. And in some ways, it means the not just that people don't believe in God, but sort of the complete nullification of the importance in the question
Right.
at its root. That God is simply nullified as a meaningful even question
Right.
or provocation. But anyway, all of this sort of leads to just a very basic fundamental question that I have for you. In Ratzinger's view, maybe you can't answer this, maybe there is no answer. What is the essence of liberalism? And we've been talking, maybe we should have asked this question at the very
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been throwing the word around liberalism as this sort
Right.
of easy shorthand for a set of political arrangements and ideologies that we all sort of instinctively know because we live within. But what does Ratzinger, the thinker, identify as the core essence of the liberal vision of our political arrangement?
I think for him, and I think this would actually fall into a critique of it, is that it is an attempt ultimately, when I was studying Balthasar there a bit ago, um, to find our transcendent end imminently. That
Yes.
this is I think so for him again. That's where his materialistic critique essentially comes out. you're trying to find
Yes.
this totalizing thing within something that can't be total. And so I think for him that is the big error. And so why do people keep on why does Europe keep on focusing on the French Revolution? Because it was such a historically violent event in some ways that really instantiated this idea of us trying to find our end within ourselves. So like understanding this has helped me understand Blondel a lot more, why he goes the way he does. And this is the fun part of Ratzinger, Balthazar, Dulubac on this. They don't uh, they don't shy away from immanentism.
They don't shy away from what?
Immanentism.
Oh, immanentism.
They're not
Yeah.
afraid of it. They're not afraid of it. Why? Because the canonic notion of truth they have.
Yes.
You can enter into something. The truth can enter into something without being overwhelmed by it. Because if it's true, it cannot be destroyed.
This is so key. To me, this is so key.
This is the heart.
I'm tempted to say you have spoken well, Grasshopper, because it tweaks all of my confirmation biases, because that is just that's all my hobby horses right there. That
Yeah.
The essence of liberalism is, in a sense, the supplanting of the transcendent with the immanent as our final end.
Yeah.
And the attempt to view human life purely and simply through the lens of the immanent domain, the immanent realm, which is, I think, an even more radical point of view than simply materialism. I mean, its
Right.
ideological grounding is in materialism,
Yes.
but then it goes another step. It goes this next step and says, well, the whole thing, all the way down, is now the whole religious question now is just nullified, and everything about in other words, we can have freedom of religion so long as we all stipulate that it has no purchase on anything beyond your private subjectivity. That's the stipulation.
Yeah.
Those are the rules of the game.
Yes.
Because everything ultimately has to come back to this immanent frame, this immanent domain. Therefore, the answer is not, and I'm on my hobby horse now, the answer is not for theologians or the church to respond by then going into a hypertrophy of transcendence, as in competition with that immanence, but to out-immanentize the immanentizers.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And this was the De Lubacian project in a nutshell. You can see it throughout in the drama of atheist humanism, his very important book, that the goal isn't to, in a sense, repudiate humanism and immanentism, yes, but to develop a deeper and more profound humanism rooted in a deeper and more profound concept of the immanent. As you correctly point out, we can do this because of our kenotic notion, Christological notion of truth. And therefore, we're right back to your big deal, which is, in Ratzinger, the historical mediation.
Yes,
of being.
Exactly. Man, so much there. And this gets back to your earlier question that Vatican II hasn't been lived enough, because I would say everything you just said is the heart of Vatican II. And I actually even think that the more problematic passages of Gaudium et Spes that you struggle with a bit more, if you read it with some charity and submission of intellect and religious submission of intellect, as well as we're supposed to with magisterial documents, if you take that canonic notion of truth seriously, you can understand this kind of hopefulness that's possible, at least with the world. So when it's not been, when I say, when Ratzinger would say that Vatican II has not been tried out enough, he's essentially saying, stop privatizing the faith.
Yes.
Stop it now. You're buying in to the very thing that's destroying you. And you're going to find, and so what happens is we find all these secondary problems that we think are the real problem. It's the form of the mass. It's the wokeism of the world. It's this. It's that. It's like, and those are all problems, and but they're not properly rooted in the fundamental problem. We are historically conditioned in a way around this immanent frame. And this is where Ratzinger's kind of apologetics takes its turn. Like you're saying, like when I did my master's on Blondel, I said essentially what you just said, that for him, the problem with immanentism is that it's not immanent enough,
Precisely. And
right?
therefore loses its true immanence.
Exactly. And that's kind of what
And
he
ends
proves.
up in a kind of Archimedean rationalism, strangely.
Exactly. And that's his proof essentially with l'action. The thing you desire is outside yourself, and it's why everyone hated him so much, because he actually showed them how naive they were as philosophers for thinking that they could figure out the problem. So obviously Hegel is a big player in all this, and I think this is why he's so vital to be taken seriously. He's not someone I've read much, but I'm understanding more and more why he's so important to engage with, because really his spirit, if you will, continues to live,
It's
live this
everywhere.
everywhere. It's everywhere.
And ressourcement thinkers have been wrongly vilified as closeted Hegelians simply because they do take him seriously.
Exactly.
But they're transforming him from within. They're gutting him from within in order to show where his imminent path leads to all kinds of I'm interrupting, but it's very instructive to me. And I was reading this somewhere. When you get hyper immanentists like a Jacob Bohm, in the German tradition and tradition of idealism, and you get this hyper immanentism, which almost always, if it doesn't have a proper Christological Chalcedonian sort of notion of the analogical relationship between the divine and the human, nature and grace, if it doesn't have that, if everything just gets collapsed into this immanent frame, even if it's cast in a spiritual term, it always eventuates in a kind of rationalism. It always eventuates in a kind of totalitarianism. It's a strange internal logic that once you lose that proper God-world relationship in your notion of the immanent, a secularized immanentism inevitably is destructive.
Yes. Sorry, my brain, ADHD sometimes means I have 20 ideas hitting my brain at once. I don't know how to get them all.
Well, I keep interrupting you, which
no,
is not
it's okay.
helping.
It's okay. No, it's fine. It's good stuff. So, okay, I'm going to just talk, and then it'll come together here.
No, just go with it, brother. Go with it.
So
let the immanent spirit flow through you.
Right, exactly. So when it gets back to Vatican II things, and I think actually, from what I recall reading it a while ago, Tracy Rowland, I think, is this kind of her argument around Vatican II and her culture in the Thomist tradition, is that maybe the one error of the council, or at least maybe like a practical consideration that was not taken seriously, was the question of culture, the subjective receptivity of what it had to say. And I think if there is to be a critique of the council, it would probably be that, because we didn't take and in that sense, we were still actually acting out of that neo-Thomistic manualism around objectivity, thinking that it's just going to be easily received. And in fact, the opposite was proved, right? So I don't think, and I think, so, and we can actually probably do some favors in discussing the council more, where if there's going to be a critique, I think that is it. But it's not a critique of substance. It's a lacuna. It's a theological lacuna.
It is, and there's another lacuna that flows from that, and I think it pertains to the Ratzingerian analysis of Vatican II, and it is this: Vatican II did not. Let's back up a second. Vatican II, and I agree with you that the ressourcement communio schools sort of won the day at Vatican II, and a lot of people agree with that. But Vatican II just sort of leaves that victory of the ressourcement school to be sort of gleaned out on your own. In other words, Vatican II implies a hermeneutic for its own interpretation, but it does not provide us with explicit keys to its own hermeneutical appropriation. What is our project? And I would submit to you that the Second Vatican Council's project is the ressourcement project, and it is this. It's ambitious as hell. It is the reinterrogation of the entirety of the tradition through a Christological, Christocentric focus and lens. And that is like, as I've said before, that's like a gambler going all in. And the council was taking a huge risk and saying, this is what we're doing. We are reinterpreting everything through this Christological reduction and this Christological lens. That is why I named my blog Gaudium et Spes 22, which is this key interpretive paragraph. It's the classic one. It's only in the light of the word made flesh that the mystery of man makes any sense. In other words, you can't understand the world unless you understand the incarnation. And that's why John Paul II quoted GS 22 in almost every single one of his major encyclicals, thus, in a sense, giving us his papal interpretation of what the hermeneutical interpretive key of the council is. Now, to get back then to Ratzinger, and then I'll let you talk since you're the guest.
This is good. No, this is good. I my one complaint sometimes is that you don't talk enough when you have guests on, so I'm grateful for this.
Okay, now, yeah. Well, that's because, well, anyway, I don't want to go to that. Anyways, so my thing would be this, and I think it's Ratzinger's as well. Immediately after the council, because the council did not provide us with its own hermeneutical key, it opened, and it didn't adequately deal with a critique of the culture into which it was moving. Immediately after the council, that door was kicked open wide by the progressive wing of the church that simply wanted to interpret aggiornamento and the opening of the church to the world as a blessing and a baptizing of that very same culture that we should have been critiquing, or at least engaging constructively in order to do this De Lubacian humanist project of some kind. And I think this is Ratzinger's analysis as well. We have not yet even begun to scratch the surface of the radicalness of what the council was actually proposing Christologically for us to do. And you are right. This is where the universal cult to holiness comes in as well. Now we have a papacy that is, in a sense, I don't know what it's doing, because it doesn't seem to be focused on that project at all anymore, which is, I think, only adding to this massive confusion and red pilling the rad trads into just rejecting the council entirely. And I think Ratzinger, therefore, is entirely right to sort of like, Dios mio, you know, the thing is, it hasn't been tried and found wanting. It has barely been tried at all.
Right. So 3 things with that, I think. One is, this is not due to any research. This is just due to me being a pastor and knowing things on the ground. And it's hard to do a thesis while you're a pastor, but also I'm really glad I'm doing it because it keeps you grounded. I think that actually is also part of the error of the council in terms of who are the theologians. Well, Ratzinger is like one of the few. He only has 2 years of pastoral experience as an assistant at the council. Like, these are guys who are ingrained in the academy. Like, it is really the first, I mean, outside of the first at 7, after the schism, this is like the first really concretely theological council. Like, it is probably one of the most theologically in-depth councils ever, written by theologians, really, truly. And I'm really grateful for it. And
by theologians for other theologians.
So that's your first problem. Well, so they didn't set up an interpretive. They set up no hermeneutic afterwards, which then how does Rome deal with it? Well, it deals with it according to the same culture. It's dealt with everything, including the initial stages of implementing the council, which kind of got kiboshed, thanks be to God, bureaucratically. So you have a bureaucratic implementation of the council, which is just presuming it's all going to be received appropriately. Like, we hear constantly all these stories about Paul VI scratching his head, what's going on with the church. And listen, I don't know if I can blame anybody for this per se. I just think it's demonstrating the poverty of things. So, like, if we want I am more and more convinced that for the church to have a broader future in the West, and I'm speaking this from my clerical experience, obviously, so take it out with a grain of salt, but we need people who are pastorally active and theologically deep. We need both. Because what it does is, the pastoral activity keeps me grounded in hearing what people's problems are. Like, it's funny, every time you hear a confession, I'm like, well, that's a problem of history ontology. At least that's what I'm thinking. But I obviously don't say that, right? I see the problem, and I see the concrete expression of it. And I so if a council were to happen today, I'd be saying, well, yeah, this is the reality that's happening. And I think that's still a problem today. I don't think hierarchically there's enough listening happening, actually. Even though we like to think we are. I think there's listening, but I think it's very one-sided. And I don't think it, and honestly, if we're going to truly listen, we need to not just listen ad intra. We need to be listening ad extra. If we're going to be missionary, what is the situation of people today? And that is the question that we all like. And this is where like Ratzinger and Guardini, these guys are so great. You can't stop asking that question ever, because history moves on. And this is where theology comes in. And this is why it's dynamic and is always, it's not just, well, here's the truths and that's it and we're good. No, we know we live in the world. We know, and that, like Ratzinger said, history is fallen by nature. It has to be, because we're fallen by nature. So, or sorry, not by nature, but like we're constituted in a fall, I should say, maybe is a better way to put it. But if history is fallen, like that means there's always going to be opposing forces in history. Always. There's always moments where an antichrist comes, if you will. And so if this is the case, we need to be aware of what those are and to engage them with the deepest pastorally rooted theology possible in order to call it out and shed a light on it and to bring it out today. That is the role of theology. So when it gets back to the council, I think we had really amazing theology, but junky pastoral experience. Because I mean, even back then, like most bishops are canon lawyers. And again, not a bad thing. And I think canon law is probably one of the more pastorally fruitful things in the church. It's actually really vital for this. But they're not, who's listening to confessions, who's doing spiritual direction, who is having fights with parishioners, pastors. And I think this is what we need to be taking seriously more if we actually want to start implementing the council, because kind of going with what you're saying is the way I've always you're right, Christologically rooted. And for me, it's that it's trying to develop a culture that takes the world seriously, rooted in a sacramental ontology.
Yeah.
This is it. And if you have that, you have everything. But the problem is when you try to implement that, everyone opposes you because you're not trad enough, or you're not liberal enough, or whatever.
I know.
And we're not looking at it from the right categories.
But that's what I mean by the failure of the Christological focus. Immediately after the council, everybody spins off into these largely political categories in their interpretation. It's liberal, it's conservative, it's trad, it's secular. And it's none of those things. Even to go along with what you just said, Ratzinger admitted, I don't know where or when, I just remember reading it as a quote from him saying that he thinks that the council, which was really a council of theologians for theologians, like I said, it was a theologians' council, which is why it must be properly interpreted through whatever the dominant theology was. But anyway, I'll come back to that. But Ratzinger says, we were so focused on getting the theology right that we didn't stop to wonder what the pastoral implications of everything was going to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why, I would argue sometimes this is maybe, and I struggle to say it because I love him so much. I would say that this is maybe even his fatal flaw at times. This is why he never wanted to be a bishop. He recognizes he's not practical. He's a very pastoral person. Like he really was. Even in all of his exercise of office, he really wanted to be with the sheep in the manner that he could be. But I think for me, actually, an argument I've constantly made, I think one of the greatest faults of his papacy, and people are going to be shocked when I say this, was Summarum Pontificum. And why?
Interesting.
Why? The theology in it's amazing. It's perfect. The principles he lays out are great. Though there's one fatal flaw. There were no practical guidelines for living it out, because he talks about this liturgical dialogue between the two forms. So he's trying to de-siloize the Latin Mass, which is the right move. Styling's bad, always. He's trying to get it rooted in parishes and stuff like this. But as a priest, I am bound by the germ, by the general structure for the Roman Missal. He's saying, well, I'm hoping there's a liturgical dialogue between the two forms. And he wants an organic growth, and that's the right thing again. The problem was he didn't lay out the principles by which one could do that. Right. And so I, as a priest, am bound by the germ. And so I can't allow this dialogue to happen. And therefore, what is a great idea never gets acted on, except for in small little ways. I would say maybe the one thing we've seen is a greater openness, at least in certain areas, towards ad orientem. I think that's been the one little thing. But outside of that, he didn't lay out the principles. And so I think that's the problem. Sometimes when you're an academic theologian, it's not always the case, but you can forget that how do you do this is an important question.
And he didn't take into consideration that by allowing the free use of the TLM, that what the net result was not going to be dialogue between the two forms and interpenetration, but the balkanization of both, and the hardening of positions of both, and the weaponizing of both liturgies one against the other, which put up this horrible dynamic. I mean, I'm with you. I mean, I think for as much concern as Pope Benedict had with the liturgy, and if you read all of his beautiful theological writings on the liturgy, one wonders why in his, how many years was he Pope? 8 years? Something like that.
Yeah, 8 years.
In all the 8 years of his papacy, why did he not then make it his number one priority to once and for all reach a resolution on the liturgical reform, to set up a new Vatican-based liturgical commission to look into how the Novus Ordo can be improved by cross-fertilization with the elements of the older rite?
I wonder honestly with that. I have a couple ponderings on that. I think one of them is I don't think we're culturally ready for that as a church.
I think that's what he thought too.
I think he thought that too. I think he could have done a study maybe and just let it kind of keep it on the DL down low and just kind of keep it in the background type of thing. But I mean, it obviously leaked out. There's that. It is interesting that for someone who loved the liturgy so much, like, I mean, technically Pope Francis has actually written more on liturgy than Benedict did, which is very interesting in and of itself. Actually, the popes in general didn't like talking about liturgy very much. No. Since like Pius XII is probably the one who did the most. Outside after that, after the council, and I don't know if they saw it as like a minefield that it just wasn't, it would cause more division than unity. I don't know. And
I also think in Ratzinger's case, Pope Benedict's case, that this comes out in his writings, he had this powerful sense that one of the problems that the liturgical reform created was this overwhelming sense that the liturgy is this human creation that is endlessly plastic and malleable, and that the church can just basically do whatever the heck it wants to do with the liturgy. And so,
and that's the attitude of a lot of priests.
Yeah, and exactly.
Just come in and just do whatever they want. I'm like,
and so I think he was leery of setting up yet another commission to come forward and say, okay, we're going to give you yet a different liturgy that represents the combining of the old with the new. And so now here you go with this new liturgy. And I think that he thought that would simply double down on this idea, which that, the liturgy is something it's our playpen that we can do what we want. So you're right. I think he wanted through Summorum for an organic development
and let it last for a long time.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say though, too, I think this is part of for whatever reason, implementation has collapsed into council, and they're not the same thing. And I find that problematic, because what happens then is, why can't we have, if we really love the truth and we really love the church and we really love Christ, why can't we have an object, like you're saying, why is it so verboten to have a real critical analysis of the implementation? Why? And not just bureaucratically from Rome, but also locally in dioceses, and also what was going on culturally. Like, why can't we ask these questions? I don't get it, because and it shows you that there's still strong sentimentalism. I think part of it is there's a lot of wounds from what the church was, because this is the other thing. People keep on forgetting this. Things were not rosy in the 1950s as much as if they were
not.
If
That's
they
why
were,
it collapsed
the church
so quickly.
Exactly. If they were, this would not have collapsed. That there were already growing issues, and this is what the council saw again, right? Like, it saw these issues. We're not rooted sacramentally and at all, and we need to reroot ourselves as this. So, and we have to take modernity seriously. It's not going away. We can't privatize this anymore. So how do we live this in the contemporary context? Here's the ideas. Here's the way we're going to build this culture, but we have to actually do that. And so I think theologically in the church today, I think this is where Ratzinger would say we have to be thinking about those questions. What are ways for the council to be implemented? I think, and how do you preach this? And that means you also have to understand, what are the mindsets of Catholics coming through the doors? Because most of them think things are privatized. Most of them act out of this. But I think this is where the movements could actually be a great counterpoint to this. Like, for me, in many ways, the way I think about how I run my parish is, I want to be a pastor to it, as if it were a movement unto itself, without it having to be any particular movement.
Yeah. But you talk about pastoral.
Yeah.
The liturgy is where the rubber meets the road. That
Yes.
is 99% of what Catholics know about their faith, is their
Hmm.
1 hour on Sunday and their encounter with the
Yes.
liturgy. And the
Yes.
fact of the matter is, the Novus Ordo was imposed from above. I mean, in a
Yes.
very haphazard fashion. My
Yep.
goodness, Louis Bouillet in his memoirs talks about how he was notified that he had 2 hours to write Eucharistic prayer too, which he did on a notepad at some restaurant in a piazza in Rome, and then quickly scuttled up to the Vatican and said, here's Eucharistic prayer number 2. And this is no way to reform the liturgy, which is why Bouillet himself became bitter about this. And the fact of the matter is, this is a festering wound in the church. We can say, well, we don't want to treat the liturgy as this fungible, changeable, endlessly plastic thing. Hey, newsflash, we already view it that way. The church already guaranteed that we're going to view it that way, when in the 1970s, it just threw this new liturgy at us. Then along comes Summorum and says, oh, by the way, that liturgy you weren't allowed to say before, now you can say that one too. And by the way, now we've got these Anglican ordinariate liturgies, so there's that too. And so all of a sudden now there's this overwhelming sense of liturgical confusion. So my attitude is, stop the insanity. If there's a reason why you have a Vatican, there's a reason why you have a Pope, and this is one of those reasons. This is a festering cancer in the church, these liturgical wars. The church needs to do something about this, and it is my deepest regret of Benedict's papacy that he engaged in halfway measures here, out of a fear of something or other. I don't know what. But he was the Pope most suited to, in a sense, bringing a certain finality to the reform of the liturgy. And it didn't happen. Now, I'm not saying that as, obviously, I love Pope Benedict. He's one of my great heroes, but no one is perfect. And I think I think he dropped the ball here. I sad to say.
Yeah,
but I, really
I wouldn't disagree. I think, there's I mean, like you said, he doesn't like bureaucratically imposing things. He thinks that that's I mean, like, people like to oppose him in Francis. There's actually a lot of stuff they're not opposed on, like Laudato Si and Caritas in Veritate are very similar, actually. Like, they build on each other. I when it came to liturgy, I mean, I think he tried to show by example. Actually, where his greatest effect was his example.
Yes.
With how he celebrated, he used media its right way. Because especially with the internet, how he celebrated Mass, you start seeing these forums pop up with candles on the altar and crosses on the altar and stuff. These things popping up all over the world. Why? They just followed his example of how he celebrated liturgy. And so I think in that sense, he helped. And also, we have to remember, we're talking from a North American context, right? Like the one thing I keep on thinking about with regards to Vatican II and liturgy and everything is they're not having issues in Africa.
No, they're not.
They're not having issues there at all. Like, well, there's issues, I'm sure, but there's always issues. But I mean, like, it's different.
My point isn't that the Novus Ordo can't engender great flourishing communities, because it does, and does so all over the world. My point is that in the first world, in like North America, Europe, it has become this festering bone of contention. So and that needs to be resolved. I'm sorry, it needs to be resolved.
It needs to be resolved, but it needs to be resolved without siloing people. And this is my big thing. And by this, I mean, you need to, like, I think there needs to be allowance for pastors to be pastors. And if they see a need in their local area by introducing certain things without it becoming something, and I hesitate to call it the Novus Ordo, because it's actually not called that. It's like the typical edition, right? It's the Mass of Paul VI.
That's what everybody calls it.
But the problem with not calling it that is it actually builds up the idea that this is something fundamentally new.
Yeah, it's true.
And it's not.
Guilty as charged.
Right? Oh, no. And it's like, I say it sometimes myself. I'm like, I keep on trying to catch myself, because there's this video out there. It's like a 3-part series on the Latin Mass, and I forget what it's called right now. And the Mass of the Ages. It's not good. It's really bad. But they keep on calling it the Novus Ordo on purpose, I think, almost in a propagandist way. Anyways, so
the whole thing is propaganda.
Yeah, the whole thing's propaganda. Anyways,
yeah.
So, but just So like, I'll give you an example. Like, I'll give you my experience at my parish, because I think this could help. And I am definitely a man formed by Pope Benedict. Uh, and interestingly, I think in some ways this actually kind of gets us back to the beginning around politics and everything, because for him, liturgy is the summation of the Christian life. It's the ordering of society in its most perfect form, which is the coming towards God and waiting for him to come, and him coming today, and allowing that coming to inform our life outside of the liturgy, right? So I chant on Sunday. I chant most of the mass myself. Like, I do
Good.
whatever's in the
Yeah.
missal. I would, I haven't introduced any Latin yet, but there's plans to do little bits here and there, because the again, what does the missal do? We've brought back the patens at communion time. My choir is starting to do little bits of chant here and there. I use Eucharistic prayer 1. I preach, I think, very solid homilies. We have at this moment in time, actually, I just received someone yesterday, so it'd be down to 27. We have 27 people in discussions, or in RCIA, or in discussions with me, or formation with me, about becoming Catholic. 27 in a parish that has 650 people on a weekend.
Yeah, that's great.
My young adult group is growing every single week. I've had people say, I've never seen so many young people here before, but they keep on saying, well, that's because you're answering our questions. You're taking us seriously. And the way you celebrate Mass makes this something that it tells me that this matters. This is important. We have the most altar servers we've ever had. Now, I allow both boys and girls. It tends to be, though, that the boys are always if they're older, they're always boys, because girls tend to, my experience has at least been that girls, I'm not against it, because again, the church, whatever the church allows, I allow.
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
And I think this is really important, because but we're seeing growth in the most secular city in Canada, by the way. And that should say something to us, that if you do liturgy well and beautifully, and you don't radicalize it, you can actually even attract the people. Like, I had someone who came up. We actually have an SSPX church in my area, small, but there is one here, and there's a family that goes there. And one of them came to Mass one Sunday. He said to me after Mass, he was, "Oh, Father, I've never seen a Mass so reverent here before. It was beautiful. Thank you so much for that."
Very good.
And that's the thing, right?
That's what we need. That's what we
That's
need.
what we need. And this is what we need to start doing. And we need to allow for these things. And as pastors, though, we have to be careful. And this is why I keep on telling young people, because like my generation and younger, we don't have the wounds of the council. And so we don't have the burdens of the traditional things that people sometimes have. But speaking to what I said earlier, that older generation does have those wounds, and they are real and they are deep. And so as a pastor, it is really my responsibility to keep them in the fold as best as possible, to bring them along as best as possible, to educate, but to listen, and to get the young people to listen to them. What were things like in the 50s? Because why do they oppose it sometimes? They don't want the church of the 1950s, and rightfully so, like rightfully so.
Yeah.
And so there comes like this almost like emotional reaction to it sometimes, because it comes from a deep wound. So we need to hear that, and we need to listen to them. But then they need to hear us to say that we're not bound by this. Is why we think it's important. And you can actually bring a real communion in the parish. And I'm already seeing it in little ways already, that the older generation, the youngers, are actually talking to each other.
And then you've got people of my generation that don't want to go back to the 1970s.
Right.
There's another deep wound. And there's the wound of the pre-conciliar church, and there's the wound of that 70s show church.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's the secret. And every generation has a wound. Every generation has a wound.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, look, we're running out of time. I wanted to talk about apocalypse, but I don't think we've got time for that, because I got to run. That only gives us another reason to have
what'll be good is it'll give me time to develop it more, because I've just
developed this idea more. All right. And I was a little bit critical of Ratzinger there with regard to, Pope Benedict, liturgy and stuff, but so I don't want to end on that note. I want to end on a deeply hagiographical note, even though he has not yet passed, because I think he is a living saint, and I think he is a giant in the church, and I pray that he lives to be 150. I don't think he wants to.
There are people, I think, if you really want, like, I've used a lot of Google Translate for this, but most of his early stuff is still not translated. Prior to 1968, it's so rich. And if you read that stuff, you realize he didn't change, and you already see these intimations of things that mature over time. You see the real maturation of a thinker. Actually, it's really beautiful to see. But there's some real riches there, some real riches. And so if there's anyone who's listening or watching this who speaks German, please start translating this stuff for us, because we need it.
Translate the Ratzinger.
Yes.
All right, let's make that our mandate here at the end of our show. Hey, Father Harrison, thank you so much for once
Thanks so
again
much.
another scintillating conversation. It helps that you and I, both of our opinions on everything are pretty much right and jive with each other. So that's always good. So, hey, thanks everybody for joining
God bless you
us,
all.
and stay tuned. We'll have Father Harrison back again someday. So thanks a lot, Father Harrison.
Thank you.